On a pale green background in the center, in bold, is the text Climate Change and Disability. Below that, it says hashtag Leave No One Behind. On the top in the center is a rising flame logo. At the bottom in the center is an image of a burning earth with a thermometer indicating high temperatures and the word help written across.
I am Nidhi Goyal. I am the founder and executive director of Rising Flame, an activist working on disability rights and gender justice for over a decade, or nearly 13 years. Environmental and climatic change impacts persons across disabilities. Let me give you a few examples. For persons living with many forms of neurological disorders, the disorder itself impairs the person's response to cold. For those living with many different mobility conditions, right? Which, for example, let's say the spinal cord injury, we're basically looking at um, a situation where the muscles don't contract enough to create the heat. They're also in a situation that the mobility is limited, that they cannot move quickly out of cold and into a warm shelter. If you take an example of people living with Parkinson's, the issue is the lack of thirst. When heat rises to disproportionately high levels, they really need to put in place systems that ensure that they are not fully dehydrated, particularly because they have this situation of lack of thirst. We know that drugs, the mental health drugs, or popularly known as psychiatric drugs, we know that they deregulate the response to heat, which means that persons using these drugs or consuming them are not able to regulate their body heat. We are really, really looking at a place where not just the heat and the cold, the extreme weather conditions are rising, but we're also looking at environmental degradation, rise of pollution. I live in Delhi NCR in India, where smoke levels are so high for 4 months that people living with respiratory disorders or using assistive devices for respiration, right? All of them, it's impossible for them to live for 4 months in this region. We're also looking at people who don't have respiratory disorders acquiring them. We're talking about rising number of persons with disabilities in the world, but it is really very, very closely linked to climate change, to environmental degradations, to disasters, and so on. We're looking at a situation here where one has to temporarily move out of the region, or suffer through and live in the degraded environment, or entirely migrate out of the city or region, right? And we know that migration or finding new jobs or even resettling in another space or city is not super easy for persons with disabilities because of accessibility, systemic, structural, many other barriers. We're looking at, again, the impact of extreme weather on people, those who use service animals, for example, right? Or have animals that support them in their disability in whichever way it is possible. What do you do with your furry companions? How do you maintain the well being of these companions in order for them to support you well? We're looking at a very, very, very severe impact or disproportionately high impact on lives of persons across disabilities. And this is a reality we need to face and act upon immediately. Some of the very strong recommendations from all of us in the disability community would be to include persons across disabilities, to have them at the table, at the national level, the regional level, and the global level, in dialogues, in strategy meetings, in planning, in solutions. It's extremely important to remember that everything about us has to be with us, basically nothing about us without us. The second, extremely important for all of us, again, is to comply with the pre-commitment, the commitment which has already been agreed upon of the $100 billion, 50-50 split for adaptation and mitigation of climate change, but also how to use these budgetary commitments, to use them to support the most vulnerable nations, so vulnerable states, vulnerable communities, but also vulnerable populations like those of persons living across disabilities. One thing is really important for us to note that we can come up with technology solutions. We're talking about EVs today, electric vehicles. We're talking about many other strategies and plans. But if we don't make them CRPD compliance with the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities, if the solutions don't think about universal design and accessibility, if we don't bring persons with disabilities at the table and think of an inclusive climate change response, inclusive disaster management planning, we're again looking at not just a future, but a today where we're leaving persons with disabilities out and behind.